3 traps to watch out for with your investment real estate. Today on the 1031 Show. Hi, I'm Alex Stavorowski with Impact 1031 and Ridgegate Financial. Over the last few years, we've talked with thousands of real estate investors dealing with the same problems we'll discuss today. The first trap to avoid with your investment real estate is the trap of the status quo. I was talking with a client the other day, and he's got a property down in San Diego, California. It's a duplex that was built back in the 70s, and the issue is it's been sitting there doing great for him for a long time, but in recent years with the real estate environment, it started going under market value. And he hasn't done a whole lot to build it back up or put money back into it to bring it up to fair market value. So the issues that he's facing are nothing's changed. And since nothing's changed, he doesn't need to change as well. When we look at situations like this for our clients, the issues that they're dealing with generally don't present a lot of pain. So they can keep going day in and day out expecting, sometime in the future, I'll be able to deal with this. Or things are fine for now, so why would I make a change? But for this client in particular, there were some circumstances in his life that ended up changing that he wasn't prepared for and he wasn't ready to do anything about. But now it's making the situation with his real estate a lot more complicated. He's not able to go down and visit the property and do the renovations that he's been putting off for a long time. He's not able to deal with it in the way that he wants because he's getting to the point where I need to sell this piece of property and I don't know if I'm going to be able to get fair market value because of the amount of work that needs to go into it. When we're looking at situations like this, our framework, whether you're joining us for the first time or an avid listener, purpose, planning, portfolio. When we look at the purpose, you're asking yourself, what actually am I trying to achieve here? What do I want to get done? The planning aspect comes into play when we think, what does it actually take to get there? And a lot of times this requires you to think outside of the box. Think about things that you maybe haven't thought of as strategies to move forward. And is the way you're thinking about it now the only way to approach a situation? But if there were no constraints, what would the ideal situation look like for you? How would you best achieve what you want to achieve? Your purpose. From there, the portfolio level is really simple. It's just about assembling the strategies that we need to execute the plan that you already have in place. So a purpose informs a good plan, and a good plan informs a solid portfolio. For this client's purpose, it's all about legacy. He's trying to figure out, what do I want to do with this property over time, and how do I want to make sure that my heirs can benefit from it? Make it a generational wealth piece of the investment portfolio. So when we look at planning for someone like this in a property that maybe is not performing as well as it should be, but is ultimately something that they want to offload or move on from because the purpose that it did serve for their portfolio isn't one that it's serving anymore. And ultimately, for this client, the legacy or generational wealth components that he's looking for, he doesn't really see being worth the amount of effort to maintain this specific property. So a plan is then going to involve what kind of steps need to be taken to get him to a point where the property that he owns, whether it's this one or something else, is more conducive to a legacy goal. So for a property under fair market value, we're looking at things like who in the area can help him to evaluate what kind of money needs to go into that property to get the best return possible. We leverage a lot of professionals in a lot of different areas for the purpose of finding the best return on their investment. And when it looks at figuring out with those professionals or what kind of people need to be involved, for this situation in particular, he wasn't able to do the work himself, so he needs somebody that can come in and handle that for him. And the status quo that he had of eventually I'll get around to fixing this property, eventually I'll be able to get down there and do it myself, life got in the way. And now he's not able to, but he's still trying to move on from this property. So the trap to avoid with the status quo is that you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, you don't know what's going to happen next year. But if the pieces that you have in place for things like your real estate are not where they need to be for the longer term goals that you have in mind, we need to start looking at plans for figuring out how can you get there and what kind of timeline comes into play. And after the plan is in place, the portfolio solutions really assign themselves, figuring out how can we passively or professionally manage properties that are now working towards legacy that you can enjoy all of the benefits, whether it's income, taxes, those real estate favorable components that you're very used to, but how can that portfolio now be built in a way that informs the purpose and lives out the purpose of the goals you have? If you think you might be falling into the status quo trap, book a call with us. We can discuss your specific situation. The second trap to avoid with your investment real estate is what's called retreating to fine. When I talk about retreating to fine, I mean that you've got a problem. Something is causing an issue, and maybe it's not causing that much pain, but enough to start looking into some options. Then once you start looking into those options, well, it starts to get a lot more complicated than you were expecting. And so I'm going to back off to where I was, what I know, what I feel is safe and comfortable, because I don't want to make any of these changes and get out into this wide unknown world. Problem with retreating to fine is that a lot of people end up with a lot more pain than they would have if they had just done something early on. If they'd taken the action when they first noticed it was important enough to set up a call or talk to somebody else, then it's a matter of taking those steps then and working through whatever complications or problems might be in the way, because ultimately they're only going to grow. And if it's causing issues now, you can likely bet it'll keep causing issues later. I was talking with a family earlier this week that has a portfolio of over 8 figures worth of investment real estate between commercial properties and residential properties. They got into real estate in the first place because they needed a building for their business. So they were in the engineering field, and the business needed somewhere to live. Over time, they started building out the portfolio to include more commercial property, more residential, but they never had the intention of becoming a landlord or a property manager. And by the time we started talking about it, the residential side of the real estate was causing a little bit of an itch. It was causing some distractions, keeping them from living the life that they wanted. And so we started talking a little bit more about, what does this actually mean for you in the long term if nothing changes? What does this look like? And getting into some of the different ways that they might be able to help solve that problem. But ultimately it became a matter of, I think I'm okay. It's not that bad. And when I'm talking with a family about a situation like this, the first place I go is our framework, which is purpose planning portfolio. The purpose component is, what are you trying to achieve? Each piece of a portfolio or each piece of your life really should have a specific purpose that it's designed to work towards. And when we're looking at something like a piece of real estate, what is the purpose of that? What was it initially? And where is it supposed to take you over time? When we're looking at a plan, what a plan can strive to do for you is accomplish that purpose. Really to take that individual piece and move it forward so that you are living the lifestyle that you want with the goals you have in mind. And a plan, a lot of times people will come to me with a set solution in mind, something that they think of as the best way to get it done. But a good question to ask is that the only way to get it done? Or is it the best way to get it done? And if not, we can certainly discuss different opportunities to figure out how can you ultimately arrive at that purpose you have in mind. From there, the portfolio solutions that help us to achieve that plan are easy to implement and execute on. So when I was having this conversation with this family about the properties that they were looking to sell, the question of purpose comes up. We're layering our framework of purpose planning portfolio onto this situation, and how does what we do align with what they're trying to achieve? So for the purpose, it was a very simple question of, what are you actually trying to do here? Ultimately, the legacy goals and generational wealth building of real estate was a top priority for him. But in the short term, it was a matter of, I need to find a way to get these distractions off of my plate so I can go and travel, enjoy my lifestyle, and do the things that I want without having to worry about this investment that I got into for a good reason, but now is not serving the purpose that I need it to. And when we look at those kinds of layers of a purpose that is not only more immediate but also long-term, that's really where the planning comes into play, is figuring out what can a plan do to make sure that it's not a legacy-only purpose. It's also a lifestyle purpose of the here and now. And for that situation, there's a number of different factors to consider. What's the timeline for moving this? How long do you want to keep dealing with this before it's painful enough, essentially, to make some sort of change? And when we're looking at a plan that helps them to accomplish both levels of that purpose, then it's going to be an important thing to consider all of the different factors that they have with this real estate. It's not their only piece of real estate, but they were coming up on the sale of one of these properties in a matter of weeks. So that's going to put some constraints of timing within the 1031 exchange to figure out what do we do coming from here. And when we first started discussing the situation, it was looking at alternative options to active management or getting back into another property. And that was really the conversation of figuring out how do we get from these distractions, the headaches that we're dealing with, into real estate that's not going to cause that, but still is providing for us in the ways that we need. For their situation, this income was more supplemental, but still necessary for them to live the lifestyle that they had in mind. So we needed to look at options that were going to be strong opportunities, but also striving towards the purpose that they had in mind. So when we were looking at the planning components of figuring out how can we help to strive towards the purpose that they had in mind, both in the short term of the lifestyle they wanted and the long term of the legacy goals that they were working towards, the planning component comes into play on multiple different levels. On one level, it's what does it take to get there? How can we achieve those goals with the most simple steps possible? Obviously, if the real estate's in place right now, there are steps to take to get it sold. They were actually about to go through a 1031 exchange with one of the residential properties, which brought up the conversation of, do we want to go back into the same sort of situation and try to find an actively managed property that we can deal with ourselves, or do we want to consider other opportunities that are maybe more passive, less of a headache, less of a distraction? So that conversation really revolved around, again, back up to striving towards that purpose that they had. What do you want to end up with? And the planning component is figuring out, is what you have in mind the only way to get there? And talking with all of the people that we work with in this space of real estate, there are a lot of different ideas on how they can achieve what they want, whether that's paying the taxes, 1031 exchanges, but there's oftentimes more than one way to accomplish a goal. And with this situation, by the end of the conversation, it was a very good conversation to talk about the different opportunities, but started to get the feeling that some of the complexities of what we discussed were going to be a little bit too much to work with. And his comment was, well, I just want to let you know we are still looking at other options, and the main reason we're here is because we haven't found anything. And I tried to challenge him on it a little bit by saying, well, I thought the main reason you were here is because these properties are a distraction, and going back into more of the same thing is not something you want to do. And that's the trap of retreating to fine. Retreating back to, well, this pain isn't as present as it would be to make me do something else. So overcoming the complexities or opening my mind to different opportunities is going to be more painful than dealing with this pain right now. So I'll come back to it later on. The problem is later on, it might be more pain than you're willing or able to deal with, and then you're going to make decisions backed into a corner instead of from a proactive approach. The problem with a lot of the traps that we see in investment real estate is that oftentimes they compound. So that first trap we talked about of the status quo, and now this trap of retreating to fine, are really things that go hand in hand. It's not uncommon for somebody to accept the situation as it is over time and think that, oh, well, this is good enough. And then when problems come up, well, it's painful, but it's not as painful as it would be of trying to make a radical shift or a big change into something else, even if that would ultimately solve the problem. So they retreat to fine, and the status quo continues. I think for a lot of these situations, a lot of the families that we talk with, that's very common and something that they're dealing with. And at the point that we get on a call to discuss the situation, the pain has gotten bad enough for them to reach out and try to get some help. But talking through some of the solutions, talking through the plan, the portfolio, can lead to a little bit of trepidation when it comes to maybe I am fine. And helping them to understand that the purpose they're trying to achieve is more important than the temporary pain it might take to get there is something that we can certainly discuss. And if that feels like you or these traps feel very familiar, feel free to book a call with us and we can discuss your situation specifically. The third trap we often see with investment real estate owners is the trap of the day-to-day. And at first glance, this may seem very similar to the traps we've already discussed with the status quo and retreating to fine. But often this presents itself in a way that somebody's been having their head down, managing properties, doing everything they can to make that investment as strongly performing as possible. And by the time they look up, they don't know where they are, they don't know where they're going. So they've been following their feet one step after the other and doing the day-to-day, but they don't have any clear picture of the long term, and trying to figure that out down the road is incredibly difficult for a lot of people because they don't know what options even exist to help them to get to where they want to go. I was talking with a woman the other day who was in a very similar situation. Her whole portfolio of real estate was spread out over a couple different states, and she was trying to figure out some ways to consolidate it and help her to own some real estate or do something that allowed her to get closer to living to her family. So she has a son out in a different state with her grandson. She wanted to be closer to them. And as we've discussed, a lot of people will come in with a strategy already in mind and trying to figure out, how can I get there? You have the tools that I need to get from A to B. I already know where those both are, and I need to cross that bridge. But when we look at our framework of purpose planning portfolio, the first question to ask is, what are you actually trying to achieve? Once we have a good grasp of what somebody's trying to do with any sort of investment or opportunity, then we look at a plan. And that involves, how do you get there? How do you arrive at that purpose, and what steps are you going to have to take between now and then? The portfolio level solutions come along after that, where we've identified the plan, the steps that we need to get, we've identified where we're trying to end up, and what are the tools that we can use to do that in the most efficient way. And applying our framework to her situation started with that question of, what are you actually trying to achieve? For her, it wasn't necessarily buying a house in the mountains. It was trying to spend more time with her family, being closer to her son, to her grandson, and figuring out the best way to do that. When we looked at what kind of plans she had already come up with, the opportunity of consolidating some of these properties, getting them sold, and buying a larger property that she could use as a rental or a vacation home was her top of mind. She said, well, that's an easy way to use the 1031 and be able to buy another property. But at the same time, part of her purpose was not wanting to deal with managing property and managing real estate, especially not in a location that was different from her own. And when we looked at some of the different plans that could come into place with the questions of, is this the best way to achieve your ultimate purpose? Or how can I strive towards that purpose with the plans in place and the opportunities that are available to me? Our discussion led into some greater depth of, is this actually the best way to do it? What happens if your son moves? What happens if you aren't able to rent this property for enough income that you would be maintaining your lifestyle over the long term? And for her, those questions really hit close to home because they weren't things that she had considered up to that point. It was a very simple transactional approach that she was taking, and part of the reason we were having the conversation was figuring out, what are the other tools, what are the other options available? And again, the day-to-day trap of keeping your head down and figuring out one day at a time, how do I manage this property, and making sure that it's working for me and cash flowing and the tenants are happy, is all well and good and important to be involved with. But you also need to have a scope of big picture, how am I using this for the lifestyle that I want to live? We see that very commonly with a lot of real estate investors. And for her, she didn't even know really the opportunities that were available to her to help her determine where she wanted to end up. And so a conversation then led into, well, what kind of tools do I have access to? What kind of plans can I put in place? And I'm going to use that to help me inform where I should end up. Ideally, we're generally starting at the end with the goal in mind and working backwards and building out a plan from there. But sometimes you need to know what opportunities you have available to figure out where you want to end up. And that was the case for her. So we had a much more in-depth conversation when it came to the portfolio level of tools and solutions available to help her determine, where do I actually want to take this and how is that best going to suit my lifestyle and the goals that I have in mind. The trap of the day-to-day is one we often see with the accidental landlord or the accidental property manager, somebody that didn't have long-term intentions of getting into owning a portfolio of real estate and managing it themselves, but maybe they rented out their residence instead of selling over time, and they've done that a couple times, and now here they are with a collection of properties. But they've had their head down managing that, dealing with tenants, and trying to balance the other responsibilities that they have, that now that they've looked up and life is changing around them, they don't know where to go. They don't know how to get there, and that's where we would encourage you to book a call with us and discuss your situation more specifically, because those kinds of questions are what we ask and help you to figure out, so that not only are we building out a plan, but ultimately you can strive to achieve your purpose. In summary, the traps to watch out for with your investment real estate are the trap of the status quo, the trap of retreating to fine, and the trap of the day-to-day, and losing sight of the big picture. If you think you might be falling into one of these traps, or you'd like help personalizing our framework to your situation, the best place to start is by booking a call with us. I'll put a link in the description below. Until next time, I'm Alex, and this is the 1031 Show.
Impact 1031 is a DBA of Ridgegate Financial, LLC. Not an offer to buy nor a solicitation to sell securities. All investing involves risk. Past performance is not indicative of future results. Speak to your finance and/or tax professional prior to invest. Securities offered through Emerson Equity, LLC. Member FINRA SIPC. Only available in states where Emerson Equity, LLC is registered. Emerson Equity, LLC is not affiliated with any other entities identified in this communication. Investment advisory services offered through AE Wealth Management. Emerson Equity, Ridgegate Financial, and AE Wealth Management are not affiliated entities.